for the technical difficulty. Are you seeing the slides o nakikita niyo po yung merong tinatype?
Is this an introduction to museums, Yufi?
Yes. Yung
Yeah,
nakikita
we
niyo
can.
po ba yung kamay ko? Ayan. Okay.
Yes.
Kinabahan ako, lumabas
All
yung
right.
ibang. Okay. So, before I start, I'd like to share with you this photo, which in a way summarizes what we do in the NUCP museums. No, this was taken on May 23, 2019. Wala pang COVID, so as you may notice, wala pang naka-face mask. And you may notice, I'm pointing at a book. This was written by Mariano Ponce himself. This was the opening of the Museo ni Mariano Ponce, and you can see yung amalgamation ng activities ng isang museum, which is to display artifacts, to connect with the community. In this case, makita natin yung last na apo ni Mariano Ponce, yung naka-pink. And then makita din natin sa likod nung officer in charge ng museum at that time, si Mr. Alex Aguinaldo, may camera. So mayroon din tayong tungkulin na makipag-engage sa media. So that's why I selected this as a cover photo. So why are museums important? No, for many of us, when they say museum, we mean a big place where there's a lot of old stuff, maybe some new stuff, and then for many it's a place to get really nice Instagram photos. Or maybe basta maganda, kaya punta ako museum. Tapos libre naman eh. So, but museums are more than just display cases. They are alternative places of learning that allow the visitor to interact visually and intellectually with the objects displayed inside. So this is the main difference between a museum and say a mall or a library. In the library, you see the books, you read the books, you research in silence as you gather information and write whatever you were supposed to write. In malls, you are supposed to buy what you see. But in museums, the objects that you see are meant to tell a story that has relevance to you. And it is shown by a lot of research that people tend to learn better from visual simulation. It's easier to, for example, in history, it's easier to remember the events when you are able to visualize it um, through pictures, through video, and sometimes through movies. Kaya nagkaroon ng resurgence sa interest sa Philippine history kasi nagsunod-sunod yung mga pelikula. So we want to replicate that same effect with museums. No? They allow for better awareness, appreciation, and understanding of history, art, and culture, and heritage. And they also allow artifacts to be conserved, restored, researched, and exhibited. So again, ang isa ring mahalagang function ng museum ay hindi lamang para maging tambakan ng lumang gamit, kundi isa rin itong lugar kung saan pwede nating alagaan, pwede nating alamin yung kasaysayan ng lumang gamit, at i-display ito sa publiko for the appreciation of everyone. Sabi nga ng Human History Collection ng Newfoundland Museum sa Canada, when you're looking at an artifact, you are looking at a person's thoughts. This is especially true for artifacts that are products of human work. Siyempre may mga museums kasi tayo na ang nidi-display naman ay natural history. We'll get to that later. And sabi naman ni T.S. Eliot, even the humblest material artifact, which is the product and symbol of a particular civilization, is an emissary of the culture out of which it comes. So kahit kaliit-liit ang bagay, mayroon po itong kwento na pwedeng ibahagi sa makakakita sa kanya. I would like to share briefly an anecdote. In one of the museums that we opened, nagulat kami because we had items excavated by the UP Archaeological Studies program. At nung nagkukay sila sa Museo El Deposito, dun sa area no, sa San Juan, ang mga nakita nila, puro mga bote, puro mga buto ng hayop na mukhang kinuha mula sa bulalo. And what does that tell us? Na yung lugar ay tinirhan ng mga tao at a certain period of time. And true enough, when we look into the historical record, at a, at a certain point in time after the Second World War, yung site pala ay tinirhan ng mga marami informal settlers. Kaya yung mga nakukay doon ay mga gamit din ng mga informal settlers na tumira doon. So mabilisan lang din po historical background. How did museums develop? I think knowing how museums develop helps us um, know what a museum is and why it is different and why we should have them. The word museum comes from the Greek word museion, the seat of the nine muses, goddesses embodying the arts and sciences. So this is the place where the nine muses are supposed to be working or gathering. Kaya yung museum as a institution is originally thought of na dito nagsasama-sama ang art, ang science, ang literature, at ang history. It's believed that the first museum was built in Alexandria, Egypt by Ptolemy Soter in 290 BC, and it was made up of rooms for research, writing, and teaching. I think if you are familiar with the Library of Alexandria, this is the same institution. No? Per library yun. Iba pa yung museum. And malaman natin mamaya kung paano sila pag-diverge. Uh, However, the earliest recorded act of using historical objects to communicate information started in the second millennium BC in Mesopotamia. So yung institution ng museum ay hindi na pala bata. It is a very long tradition. And in Greece, no, what they would do is that collected objects na inoffer sa mga gods, dini-display nila yon, especially if it's not perishable. So when they are displayed, nakikita siya ng mga tao. And nakikita nila, this goddess is glorious because she has a lot of uh, gifts. Ganyan. And nakikita ito sa inner sanctum ng temple na tinatawag na cella or naos. Now, during the Renaissance, dito na unti-unting mabubuo yung museum as we know it. Because as we know, if you accumulate wealth, we tend to buy a lot of things. And in the case of the wealthy during the Renaissance, what they would do is they would build uh, rooms or even a set of rooms uh, called studiolo or cabinet of curiosities, and they will put all sorts of things there: paintings, animal specimen, antiquities, uh, so iba-iba. Pati mga bagay from other cultures, pinapakita nila. And that's the way they display their wealth. Parang nagpapagpag sila ng yaman nila. That's the bigger your collection was, the richer you were. And sa Renaissance, alam naman natin na ang competition between states is really money is power. Diba? Parang sa mercantilism. Magkakaroon naman ng public museum, the thing that people can see and study kasi yung mga nakita natin before, hindi naman siya open to the public, libre, tapos may mga guides. Magsisimula yung ganitong konsepto sa Louvre. So the Louvre was a former royal palace that was converted into the museum after the French Revolution. And when Napoleon Bonaparte became emperor of the French, kapag may nasasakop siyang lupain, kumukuha na rin siya ng mga uh, art doon, kuha siya ng mga ethnographic artifacts. Kaya matataka kayo bakit may mga European cities pero nandun yung mga obelisk ng mga Egyptian, may mga statwa doon ng mga Greek and Roman gods, kanyan. Kasi nga, ganun yung style na sakop ko, kuha ko. So pagdating sa mga British, pati yung mga royal jewels ng Burma, yung mga yaman ng Africa, nakukuha nila kasi sinakop nila, amin na to. And display nila. Now in the Philippines, meron din yung mga universities sa tinatawag na Gabinetes de Física. So may mga rooms sila na naka-assign to display yung mga um, natural, yung mga specimen ng mga hayop usually, no? And ginagamit nila ito para magturo sa mga estudyante. Ito yung kaya halimbawa yung UST museum, dito magsisimula siya sa mga display ng mga Gabinetes de Física. And of course, in an unofficial way, pag dinidisplay ng mga simbahan ng kanilang mga santo, that's also somehow like exhibiting them to the point na I learned na ito pala yung nangyari sa Bible or ito pala yung nangyari ng panahon ni Jesus kasi ito yung mga santo or ito yung ito yung mga banal na tao and pwede kang maglakad sa loob ng simbahan at makikita mo itong mga santo ito. Magkakaroon lamang ng formal na museum sa Pilipinas na publicly owned noong 1901 nang itatag ang Insular Museum of Ethnology, Natural History noong 1901. So ito na ngayon yung National Museum of the Philippines. And in the case of NACP museums, we could trace may unang bahay na ginawang parang museum or shrine would be the Mabini House, formerly in Nagtahan, na binuksan sa publiko noong July 23, 1941. Since then, nag-collect na nag-collect ang gobyerno kaya may 27 museums ang NHCP. Labas pa sa mga branch ng National Museum. So you can imagine a lot has changed since 1901 and 1941. So to cap this short um, background, no, the definition of museum as defined by the International Council of Museums is a non-profit making permanent institution in the service of society and of its development and open to the public which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits for purposes of study, education, and enjoyment material evidence of people and their environment. Medyo mahaba, pero pwede natin itong himay-himayin. Unang-una, museums are supposed to be non-profit. Ibig sabihin, although you charge collection fees or you ask for donations, museums are not supposed to be for profit. Kasi kung for profit yan, theme park na tawag dyan. So for example, yung collection ng mga lumang bahay sa Bataan, although they are preserving old houses and exhibiting them, dahil ito ay for profit, hindi natin siya masasabing museo. No? It has to be permanent. So madami kasi tayong na-encounter ng mga local governments who would make an exhibit about their town's history sa isang mall or sa munisipyo. Pero after ng piyesta, tanggal na agad. We cannot call that a museum because it's not permanent. It has to be permanent. It has to be in the service of society. So kung ito ay self-promotion lamang ng isang political family or uh, isang company, parang mahirap naman yata matawag na museum. Unless of course, uh, na-check yung boxes na ito ay bukas sa lipunan. Ibig sabihin, ito ay pwedeng puntahan, ito ay pwedeng pag-aralan, pwedeng, pwedeng tingnan yung mga artifacts sa loob ng mga seryosong pag-aaral dito. And of course, yung main functions niya, to acquire, to conserve, to research, to communicate, and to exhibit material evidence of people and their environment. So let's simplify that. Four main functions of the museum is to collect. Number one, to collect. So talagang medyo magkukuha talaga tayo ng mga gamit. Pangalawa, to preserve. Pangatlo, to research. Pang-apat, to exhibit. So let's always remember these four things as we go through developing a museum. And what can be involved in a museum? Marami po kasi uri ng museum. We will discuss that in a short while. And you can have museums that have natural, archaeological, and ethnographic monuments and sites of historical monuments and sites of museum nature. Institutions with collections of or displaying live specimens of plants and animals, botanical or zoological gardens, aquaria and vivaria, science centers or planetaria, kaya po ang planetarium ay under National Museum of the Philippines, conservation institutes and exhibition galleries, nature reserves, international, national, regional, or local museum organizations or agencies responsible for museums, nonprofit research and education, organizations related to museums and museology. So ito napakalawak po ng saklaw na pwedeng maging museo o pwedeng i-consider na museum or pwedeng gumawa ng museum. As long as you will display something that is not for profit and that displays not just for display but also for conservation and for research, that you can call that a museum. So ano po yung iba't ibang uri ng museum? We have, for example, general museums. Ibig sabihin, lahat-lahat na ng pwedeng, yung nabanggit natin na category, sama-sama sila sa iisang bubong o sa iisang institusyon. So they deal with different disciplines from biology, anthropology, ethnography, and fine art. So, for example, ang Ayala Museum, which is now in the process of renovating, if I'm not mistaken, meron silang galleries about art, pero meron din silang galleries about history. So, and meron din silang galleries about ethnography and archaeology. So, nandun halimbawa yung Gold of the Ancestors, may silang collection na nakadisplay na um, about blue and white ceramics. So, they can consider them general category museums. Meron din yung National Museum. Meron National Museum of Natural History, National Museum of Fine Arts, National Museum of Anthropology, and Planetarium. At yung Manila compound pa lang po yun. General museums. You have fine art museums, which display art mainly on different art periods. So halimbawa po niyo yung Metropolitan Museum of Manila at yung Iloilo Museum of Contemporary Art. Meron tayong mga military or police museums. So ang AFP at PNP ay may kanya-kanya museo at ang usual na pinadi-display dyan, military history, mga lumang barel, lumang um, uniforme, mga battle plans, to tell the story of that organization, kung military man yan o police. You have science museums na very experiential, natuturo ng siyensya. Merong static, merong interactive, at merong both. So, ang magandang halimbawa po nito, may museum, at po yung planetarium. Meron tayong medical museums na ka-devote sa kasaysayan ng kalusugan. Halimbawa po nito yung Gotek-Tai Medical Museum at saka yung Kulion Museum and Archives. Local museums, na ang focus ay yung kasaysayan at kultura ng isang lugar. And I would like to think that the Imus Historical Society is interested in making this type of museum and they discuss the history, culture, and progress of a locality. So halimbawa po niyan na nag-e-exist ngayon na maganda is yung Museo Valenzuela, yung Quezon City Experience, and if I'm not mistaken, baka may representative tayo mula sa bagong bukas ng Museo Tinlupa. So those are the examples of local museums. And the one that I had more or less more experience with is history or lifestyle museums. So they feature historical artifacts of a period or an eminent personage, sorry. And madalas, uh, ito yung bahay ng isang bayani o isang lumang structure or isang lumang bahay na kinonvert into a museum, which comes with its own limitations and advantages as well. So just a very quick lang po na run through, I would like to share lang na we have 37 museums. At dito ko po babanggitin kung ano po yung 8 na binanggit po ni Dr. Abella na kanina. And you may also visit these museums for benchmarking once COVID is no more. So meron po tayo sa yung kumbento po ng Baraswain Church ay ngayon po ay nag-host sa Museo ng Republika na 1899 sa Malolos, Bulacan po ito. Museo ng Katipunan sa Pinaglabanan Memorial Shrine sa San Juan, Metro Manila. Museo ni Apolinario Mabini sa PUP Santa Mesa. So nasa Santa Mesa na po yung bahay ni Mabini. Nanap po siya sa Nagtanan. And there's a gallery beside it that tells the story of Mabini. Ang Museo ni Jose Rizal Fort Santiago sa Fort Santiago, Intramuros, sa Manila. Museo ni Apolinario Mabini sa Tanawan City, Batangas. Museo ng Paglilitis ni Andres Bonifacio sa Bonifacio Tile House sa Maragondon, Cavite. Museo ni Emilio Aguinaldo sa Kawit, Cavite. isa kung saan dineklara ang kalayaan ng Pilipinas noong 1898. Museo ni Jose Rizal Calamba sa reconstructed na bahay ni Jose Rizal sa Calamba kung saan siya pinanganak. Museo ni Miguel Malvar sa Santo Tomas, Batangas. Museo ni Manuel Quezon sa Quezon Memorial Circle sa Quezon City. Museo ng Kasaysayang Panlipunan ng Pilipinas sa Angeles sa dating Pamituan Mansion. Museo ni Marcelo H. Del Pilar sa Bulacan, Bulacan. Museo ni na Leon at Galicano Apasible sa Taal, Batangas at isa po to sa mga unang kuhong nahawakan straight from entering the NHCP. Open in 2016. Kasama po yan ng Museo ni na Marcela Marino at Felipe Agoncillo sa Taal, Batangas. Halos magkalapit lang po ito, ilang bahay lang pagitan, kaya sabay na rin po binuksan noong 2016. Museo ni na Juan at Antonio Luna sa Badok, Ilocos Norte. Was also involved in the curatorial development of this museum. Also with the Museo ni Jose Rizal Dapitan sa Dapitan, Zamboanga del Norte. Museo ng Kasaysang Pampulitika ng Pilipinas sa Casa Real Malolos. Museo ng Libingan sa Ilalim ng Lupa ng Nagcarlan, so yung Nagcarlan Underground Cemetery. Meron na rin po siyang gallery sa gilid that tells the story of the cemetery. Museo ni Ramon Magsaysay sa Castillejo, Zambales. Museo ni Jesse Robredo sa Naga City sa Bicol. Museo ng Pamana at Kasaysayang Boholano sa Luay, Bohol. Nagkikwento ko ano nangyari sa Bohol after ng earthquake at ano yung ginawa para mag-preserve yung heritage niya. Presidential Car Museum sa Quezon Memorial Circle. Museum of Philippine Economic History sa dating Inchausli Company Building. Museo El Deposito sa Pinaglabanan Muli. Dito po yung naka-display yung mga bulalo na nahukay ng UP Archaeological Studies Program. Museo ni Mariano Ponce sa Baliwag, Bulacan. Yan nasa una nating slide. Museo ni Baldomero Aguinaldo sa Pinakayan, Kawit, Cavite. Museo ni Ataklata ni Diosdado Macapagal sa Lubao, Pampanga. So ito po yung 27 na museums na meron po ang NHCP. Nakatulong na rin po tayo sa development ng 5 museum na tinurn over din natin sa institusyon na may hawak. Museo ng Pagkaing Ibatan sa Basco, Batanes. Museo ng Guerrilla sa Sorsogon sa isang portion ng isang restored na Gabaldon building. Julian Museum and Archives with funding from NCCA. Prudential Fule House sa San Pablo, Laguna, funding from DepEd. And recently, ngayong March lang, Museo ng Sorsogon sa dating provincial jail, Sorsogon City, Sorsogon. So, sa NECP museums, gaya na nabanggit natin kanina na 4 main things: we collect and we preserve historical artifacts, we exhibit them, and we make research. Kaya po may mga teksto tayo makikita sa museum. But at the same time, we try to engage the public. Kaya makikita natin, for example, sa Nagcarlan, underground cemetery siya, pero may program siya na kite flying to engage the community and to make them interested in the museum. And of course, meron din tayo mga lectures and meron din mga audiovisual presentation na nasa loob so that people who visit can learn more about the person they're visiting or the hero that the museum is remembering before they proceed inside. May mga technology like touchscreen and all that. No? So can anyone set up a museum? Technically, yes. Wala pong agency na naglilisensya ng museum sa Pilipinas. However, it takes time, effort, support, and advocacy from its immediate stakeholders. We cannot just put things inside a room, call it a day, and then call it a museum. There's a lot of effort involved. So we need to, and hindi po pwede na basta naglagay lang tayo ng gamit sa loob na isang room without arranging them properly or without formulating a story, tapos tawagin na natin siya museum. We also need to identify who in our community would greatly benefit from the exhibition or for the museum that we are planning. No? So we have to ask these questions. What should be shown in the museum? What is the importance of the museum to the community? Or for the cases of some institutional museums, ano ba relevance ng museum sa institution na to? Why should we set up a museum? Does it help tell the story of the institution or of the community. Nakakatulong ba to para matuto yung mga bisita? And what values or learning would the museum impart to the community? So, ginagawa pa lang natin yung museum, we need to formulate na ano ba yung gusto nating ituro through this museum. No? So, ano po yung proseso ng paggawa ng museum? Mahaba po siya. And let's start now how to discuss that. The first step is to conceptualize the museum. Ilista na ho natin ano po yung gusto nating mangyari sa museum. Ano po yung and objectives niya. In general, of course, we need the museum to be something that teaches, something that allows people to learn more about the community. No? And we have to draft a narrative. Kahit po one page lang na story, this is the museum that we want to establish. Uh, it will teach people, ganyan. It will display artifacts of so and so. So, at least kailangan po natin siyang manifest through written narrative. Kahit hindi po siya magkahaba-haba. And dapat malinaw din po sa mga magsusuporta sa museum, be it a local government, be it a historical society, be it an institution, no? Kailangan, when they read the narrative, malinaw sa mga makakakita, ito pala yung gusto nating buuin. So once you have the idea for the museum, you also have to select the artifacts for display. So hindi po, I've seen museums na mostly pictures lang in Sintra ang naka-display and medyo sad siya. If you can get the artifacts, original artifacts to display in a museum, that would be really nice because iba pa rin po talaga makakita ng original. Meron pa rin po siyang effective um, nakaka-affect pa rin po siya ng emotion. At the same time, they make people curious. So let's select artifacts vital to the theme and storyline of the museum. So you use the narrative to select the items that you display in the museum. Kasi po, halimbawa, kung mag-establish po tayo ng museum, magka-call for artifacts po tayo, how do we know which to display, which to accept, and which to reject? Kasi baka po may mga kasama tayo na ang gawin, oy, may museum, may lumang gamit kami dyan, bigay na natin. Tapos kung ano na yung binigay. So how do we sift through those things? Especially since the space of a museum is limited. Select artifacts that are of a good condition and avoid displaying damaged objects that may deteriorate further. Consult a conservator on the appropriate means of display. So, may mga bagay po kasi na baka mabigay sa atin pero malutong na, baka pag display natin, lalo lang masira. We have alternatives for that. Paano natin siya may papakita na hindi nasisira yung original. Perhaps we can have reproduction. So we'll deal with that later. No? So you have to be always careful in handling artifacts. We can have a whole webinar discussing how to handle artifacts based on iba po ang pag-handle ng papel, iba po pag-handle ng wood, iba po pag-handle ng metal. May kanya-kanya po yan na conditions na mahirap pong ma-discuss sa isang upuan. Iba rin po kailangan yung storage area nito at yung lugar kung saan i-display. May certain temperature, may certain humidity para hindi po masira yung gamit. And for tactile exhibits, and this happens, probably not now kasi COVID, but we have museums where we allow people to touch certain things. So syempre mahirap naman po magpahawak na original. So we can use models and reproductions. So for example, just to share, makita po natin sa picture na ito yung aking colleague na si Ms. Rosel Cruz. She is holding bibliographic card po ni Rizal. So he lists his books in pieces of paper, and those pieces of paper are still surviving right now. So we know which books were owned by Rizal thanks to these book cards. And nakapreserve po ngayon yan sa NHCP. But we don't display them kasi nga masyadong manipis. Baka pag nailawan, baka pag nakita ng mga tao, baka masira. So yun iniwasan natin. So we can put facsimiles, which is basically almost exact copies, pwedeng yun ang i-display natin. In the case of this one, sa kanan naman makikita natin yung Touch the Artist's Vision. Isa po itong program with the Rotary Club of San Juan. And what we did here, may mga selected artifacts na ginawa ng smaller version na pwedeng hawak-hawakan ng mga blind visitors. And then yung text niya sa katabi, naka-braille. So this allows people with disabilities to learn from a museum kahit meron silang disability or even if they're differently able. Now, isa pong sakit, and I've observed it, this even sa loob ng NACP, sometimes, sa sobrang eager ng mga kamag-anak to give to a museum, masyadong mga mabilis ang mga pangyayari. So biglang, oh, bigay mo na yan, lagay mo na yan, lagay mo na yan. Isa ho malaking task natin pag magbubuo ng museum is to make sure that we know if the item is loaned or donated. Kaya po mahalaga, kung ito po ay donated, mahalaga pong may need of donation. Kung ito po ay loan, dapat po may loan agreement po kayo between the institution or between the museum and the person lending the item. Ito rin po ay para sa protection ng both parties. Paano pag may nasira? Paano kung gusto na kunin nung nagpahiram yung gamit? Nandun po siya sa loan agreement. And perhaps we can have a different discussion on ano po yung usually makikita sa loan agreement. No? And then of course, once you've collected the items, you can form an accession list. Ililista na natin yung mga gamit through a certain form. Susukati natin yung mga items, pipicturean natin siya at gagawa natin siya ng accession form. Bago pa siya pagsamasamahin, and nanumberan po natin yung bawat item, especially if it's already owned by the museum, to make sure na wala pong nawawala. Kaya rin po nagkakaroon din ng annual inventory ang mga museums. To check na walang nawawala, walang biglang kinuha ng kusino, walang nasira in the course of the year. So this is what we do for artifacts. Now, once you have uh, a narrative and you have the artifacts to tell that narrative, you also need to have a museum building. In the cases of many NACP museums, nauuna si building kesa sa artifact or sabay silang dumarating kasi binodonate ng pamilya yung buong house school. But we have had experiences where we have to build from scratch and mas maraming opportunities actually building from scratch because you can make the building more modern, you can make the building more adapted to current needs. Kasi pag bahay yan, di naman na ina-expect na isang bahay na darating ang panahon na may 5 bus na gusto bumisita sa bahay at iikot sa kanya. So syempre, yung mga entrances and exits is smaller kasi bahay lang naman yun compared sa isang museum na built as a museum. So, in the case of the Imus Historical Society, I've been told na meron na building. That is a very good development. So at least once you have a narrative, once you have the artifacts, you have a place to put the artifacts in as you try to develop the exhibition. So at least okay na po yun. As much as possible, if you're starting from scratch and talagang tiwangwang na lote po tayo nagsisimula, we can consult an architect on how to plan the museum exhibition spaces para po matiyak na meron po kayong space for display, may space po kayo for the office of the curator, may space po kayo to do public programs, which we will discuss later. So hindi po kayo masyadong siksik pero may available na space. Now, as much as possible, unless that the building that you have is a 19th century structure na mahirap nang i-modify, as much as possible, we should make it easily accessible to both able-bodied and physically challenged persons. So, kaya po minsan may mga museum na binitayuan na ng rampa para makapasok yung mga bisita. Sometimes meron ng elevator so they can go from one floor to another. And gaya na and the exhibition space must be wide enough to accommodate a sufficient number of people without causing any damage to the exhibits. Ito rin po yung isang warning doon sa usapin natin kanina for artifacts, we might be too eager to display a lot of things. But if the space is limited, kailangan po nating mag-adjust. Kasi po, we have to plan gaano karami yung magkakasya sa isang room at a certain time. Uh, Gaya na nabanggit ko, may mga museums po kasi ang NHCP na at one time, 5 bus ang pumapasok. So imagine if you have a very cramped space, you have a lot of artifacts, tapos 5 bus worth of children ang papasok. That's a recipe for disaster. Especially now na may COVID, no, we also have to um, take into consideration paano ba magiging posible ang social distancing sa loob ng museum. Uh, so mag-share lang ako ng anecdote. Minsan may mga museums kami na nadadamage siya ng artifact. I don't like to admit that, no? Pero kasi nga ang dami masyadong paong pumapasok, masyadong maraming artifact, and we really wanted to display a lot of things because we thought na mas matututo yung mga visitors that way. So nagdodoble ingat na lang yung mga museum staff to make sure na hindi siya na sasage, hindi siya na dudot yung mga artifacts. No? Now we have to also determine the scheme or layout of the exhibits through the floor plan of the exhibition space. So once we develop the narrative and once we develop a list of artifacts, we also have to visualize now. How are we going to divide the space and what kinds of stories are we going to allot in each space and what kind of artifacts are we going to put there or what image or what technological thing are we going to put in that space that can tell the story that you want to put in that area. This is especially true sa mga museums na ang balak nilang exhibition is permanent. Minsan kasi may mga museums that what they would do, they will subdivide the spaces and they change exhibits from time to time para lagi may bago. Pero yun, we have to determine the scheme or layout of the exhibits. And we have to also ensure that the layout of the artifacts are visually accessible to all people. So pati po yung pagpuposisyon natin ng mga artifacts, we have to consider na kita ito ng mga tao. Kasi may mga instances na sobrang daming artifact from floor to ceiling artifact, ganyan, na kailangan pang yumuko or tumingala ng tao. Iwasan po natin yan. As much as possible, our displays should be eye level and our displays should be just enough for the people to understand what's going on. Kasi pag tinambakan natin na masyadong marami, baka ma-overwhelm naman yung senses ng titingin. And at the same time, kailangan din po nating iplanuhin such that pag may tumayo habang tumitingin sa isang artwork, hindi niya nabablock yung mga ibang tumitingin. Kasi once you have a very small confined space at ganun yung po yung style ng pagkakagawa natin, talaga magkakabungguan yung mga tao habang tumingin. It's a big no-no, especially during these times. Now, after assigning places or assigning spaces to each gallery, we will also have to determine now yung i-flesh out na natin yung details. Ano yung gagamitin natin to display certain items? Are we going to use pedestals? Are we going to use pedestals with glass casing or acrylic casing? Do we print big photos of certain places so that unang tingin pa lang, kita na siya? Paano yung lighting? How do we make sure na nakikita yung item without the item being destroyed by light? Speaking of light, ito rin po yung dahilan kung bakit maraming museums ang mag um, ayaw mag flash lighting. Nasa flash photography kasi baka masira. I see that I'm already talking 1 minute an hour. So bibilisan natin. So determine the lighting requirements of the exhibit, determine the arrangement of the artifacts, and position your artifacts to allow the viewer to approach them as closely as possible without literally making them touch the artifact. kasi it's a big no-no. So let me just show you these two documents that we prepared. No, this one is for Museo El Deposito. Ito po yung typical na itsura ng isang narrative. So it's just a few pages, merong about the museum, may goals of the museum, and then you list the galleries. And ano po yung makikita um, sa area na yon. So sometimes, ang style po namin dyan, we put two columns. The column on the left, they tell the story. The column on the right, ano yung contents niya. So maglalagay ba kami ng TV na may nagpe-play na video, maglalagay ba kami ng pedestal, maglalagay ba kami ng reproduction of artifacts or original artifacts. And then, if you are the type, kung ang institusyon niyo po ay magpapabid out sa isang curatorial development company, you will also have to prepare what we call a program and scope of work. So makikita po natin dito ilang ilang libong piso ano yung budget na ilalagay natin per part of the project. So speaking na, sabi ko na ho yung narrative, ito po yung summary ng museum, ano yung kinikwento niya. Iba pa ho ito sa exhibition text. Ang exhibition text, yun na po yung nakikita natin sa pader, yun na po yung nakikita natin sa caption cards, yun na po yung nakikita natin. Pati yung script, kung may hologram kayo na may nagsasalitang tao, ano yung sinasabi niya, that's part of the exhibition text. Now, um, the exhibition text, yun po yun na yung magkikwento nung gusto nyo pong ikwento. And kailangan maintindihan po siya ng at the very least grade 6 or grade 7. Kasi po kung masyado pong highfalutin yung mga salitang gagamitin natin, baka hindi rin basahin. Sayang effort. Pag masyadong mahaba, baka hindi na basahin. Magpipicture na lang siyang ganyan. So we have to balance yung haba ng text such that hindi po siya masyadong mahaba. Pwede siyang basahin ng uh, casual visitor na hindi nag-worry about time. And the good thing about modern museums is that you can use art and technology to do the storytelling. In this case, sa Museo El Deposito, I would like to use this example. Instead of having a long paragraph explaining na yung museum ay yung underground reservoir ay nasa ilalim ng park na makikita nila sa labas, we just put up a scale model. Tapos makikita po nila sa ilalim nandun na yung mga tubo. If we have really long texts and limited walls and we really want to tell the story, sometimes we use touchscreen terminals like this one. So sa Museo del Deposito, may mga nakuha po kaming old plans ng underground reservoir at saka ng waterworks ng Maynila during the 1880s. So instead of displaying all of them on the walls, we used a touchscreen terminal. And to tell the story na yung area na yon more or less ay naging bahagi na evolution ng 1896 instead of putting full scale na mga mukhang katipunero sa gilid, we opted to use virtual reality. So we can use technology to tell the story, and we can also use art to tell the story of the museum. So ano po yung kailangan natin? Kailangan po natin, sometimes it's easier to just get a curatorial development company and just tell them, oh, ito yung gusto namin gawin. Bahala ka kayo dyan. But it's also more expensive. If you want to try it on your own, you want to cut on expenses or you want more creative control over the process, more or less you would need, of course, a curator and a museum guide. Full-time or voluntary, sila po yung nakatingin sa museo. And most often than not, sila din po yung maasahan ninyong mag-visualize ng kwento na gusto yung ikwento at yung nitty-gritty details ng saan ilalagay si gamit, saang pwesto, paano siya makikita ng maayos. Curator takes charge. You also have researchers who will write the exhibition text, who will do the visits to archives, who will do the interviews that are required to give the details of the narrative more neat. At sila rin yung makakatulong maghanap ng artifacts. You also need a graphic artist para dun sa layout ng mga text once they're put on the walls. Gaya na nabanggit kanina, for the building itself, you need an architect. You might also need an interior designer and of course, the ones who will actually do the hard part. Kailangan natin ng electrician for the lighting and carpenters for the setting up of the panels. Now, you must also ensure that the museum is sustainable. Madali mag-put up ng panels. The question is how we maintain them and how do we make sure that people are visiting it. Kaya po kailangan tanungin natin, will it receive full support from the local government or kaya na ng institution natin to pay the bills and to pay for the collaterals like yung promotion. Kaya ba? Pangalawa, kailangan natin masettle. Maniningil ba tayo ng entrance fee? Mangungulekta ba tayo ng donations? Or just free all throughout? In the case of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines and the National Museum of the Philippines, they accept donations but hindi po nang hiningil na entrance fee because the thought is this is taxpayer funded, therefore it should dapat may sapat yan na pondo mula sa gobyerno. Will we sell merchandise or will we put up a cafe to help the sustainability of the museum? And ano yung implications ito sa space allocations? Because the more space that you give to these sustainability activities is less space that you allocate for display. Also need to plan for the long term. Once a museum is open, gaya na nabanggit natin kanina, of course you have the curator and the museum guide to look after the museum. But to make people remain interested in the museum, we have to mount public programs such as lectures, workshops, outreach activities, and special exhibits. So ito po yung nakita natin kanina doon sa apat na picture. Sometimes museums would even make competitions, minsan webinar, minsan workshop. This is to make sure na people come back kasi they see something new. And nananatiling buhay yung museum. Kasi without this, ang person, baka bumisita siya, tapos di na siya babalik ulit. Kasi nakita ko na yan. And for this to happen, we need to allocate a space for it. Kasi kung kailangan natin, kung sa labas ang venue nito, ang nabisita nila, yung venue na yon. Pero if the activity is done within the museum's premises, visitor count yun na yon. You also need to establish a consistent engagement online. So, as much as possible, kung sino man po yung magiging tao natin sa museum, dapat medyo tech-savvy because this is how we invite people to go into our museum by telling them online. Kaya po, very basic, magkaroon po ng Facebook page, gusto niyo po ng Instagram, gusto niyo po ng website and Twitter, that's also nice. At ano po yung mga tipong pinopost dito? You can post museum activities. You can post, someone special visited our museum. Ito yung naging resulta ng aming webinar, for example. Para nakita nila buhay yung museum. Nakikita ng mga tao na buhay ang museum and it's worth supporting, worth visiting. And we can also plan for long-term partnerships. So, under the National Commission on Culture and the Arts, merong, if I'm not mistaken, that's the National Committee on Museums. And under them, may mga association of museums. So in the case of Imus, I believe ang nakakasaklaw po sa atin ay yung Southern Luzon Association of Museums. So pwede po tayo once the museum is open and alive, we can join this Association of Museums for networking, para po pag na-inoffer po silang training for our museum staff, pwede po silang makasama doon. And benchmarking, may pag-coordinate, magbisita sa ibang museo para makita nila how they're doing it. In the if the museum is inclined to history and heritage, they can also join the local historical committees network. So isa po itong samahan ng mga historical organizations that are committed to researching, preserving, and sharing local history. Kasi po bawat lokalidad ay may ambag sa pambansang kasaysayan. And ang way ng NACP to gather local histories is through this network. And some museums, they also join the Asia-Europe Museum Network, allowing them to be promoted even sa labas ng Pilipinas. So for example, some of the NACP museums are members of this museum network. So nandun sila sa website ng Asimus at nakikita ng mga dayuhan, oh, may museum pala sa lugar na to, let's visit. So those are the things that we need to consider as we um, plan our museums, as we establish them, and we can have more specific questions during the question open forum. But for now, thank you very much for listening, and I hope this lecture helped us um, or is use para po sa ating lahat. Maraming salamat po and God bless po.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Agbayani. That was truly a very enlightening talk, especially for us, the Imus Historical Society organization, who is currently planning the Doña Paula Ramirez Saraza Heritage Center and Museum. And of course, not just that, for our participants tonight who wants to become part of us, that has their advocacies and in terms of heritage conservation and preservation. We also have some numerous organizations and institutions that I hope you've gained knowledge from the basic museum management and perspective on creating such an exhibit. So at this point, we will now open our forum for an orderly flow, and in order for us to accommodate as many participants as we can, please raise your hand using the raise hand button in your Zoom app, and our team will put you in the queue. When your name is called, please open your camera and microphone, state your name, the institution you represent, and go straight to the question. So we're now opening our floor to some questions. So perhaps I can start now the Q&A portion. Yufi, that was a very good talk. No? Thank you very much for that. My question is, because we have numerous academic institutions tonight who joined us, from schools. So how can these institutions, academic institutions, can play a vital role on building up such a community museum?
Okay, first things first, NACP museums benefit greatly from educational institutions. Malaking bahagi ng mga bisita ay galing sa mga eskwelahan, sa mga colleges and universities. So, as we've discussed, museums are meant for teaching. So, unang-unang maitutulong nila, dalhin niyo po yung mga estudyante niyo sa museo. Pangalawa, pag dinala niyo po sila sa mga museo, don't just make them visit, tapos uwi, tapos wala na. And then, don't also make them just write a reaction paper. Hindi naman na nila babasahin afterwards. But ask your students, what did you learn? What artifacts uh, got your attention? And lastly, hindi pala lastly, number 3 muna. One also thing, marami sa mga educational institutions support museums through participating in its program. Seminar, webinar, lectures, workshops. Maraming mga teachers yung sumali. Not just for the CPD points, but really genuinely to learn. And ganoon din sa mga students, they join to learn. And lastly, sometimes baka hindi natin nare-realize ito, but educational institutions have really good collections on depending on the age of the school or the educational institution. Perhaps you have things that may be old in good condition and instructive. So perhaps you have an option of showing them to people from time to time. You have the option of lending them to museums or donating them to museums, or you have the option of opening a gallery or a museum of your own. So I think these are just a few of the ways that educational institutions can help, not just in establishing, but in maintaining and making museums alive. I thank you
All
for the
right.
question.
All right. Thank you for that, Yufi. Any more questions from our audience? You may use the raise hand button so that we can call you and ask your question. So if you're shy, we can read your questions on the chat box. I will read it on behalf of you. So,
Okay.
Ma'am Miss Tita, you may unmute. Please unmute. Apo.
Okay, yes, this is very educational, very informative, and I think everybody is enjoying and are interested in this lecture. Since museums are built not for profit, I guess there are so many museums whose maintenance is so much. They need a lot of money for security and all that, like the big museums that we visited abroad. So they need a lot of funding for this. If it is a non-profit organization, from where would they get money to keep it safe? Because they spend millions for the safety of these artifacts.
Um, pag sinabi naman po non-profit, it doesn't mean that they are not allowed to engage in certain activities that will um, bring money in. No? So, for example, a lot of museums abroad, they really have souvenir shops, they have museum cafes, and all that. But the point is not the main thing is not the cafe and the souvenir shop. The main thing is the display. Parang you just need the money. No? Marami rin po sa kanila kasi malalaking mga endowment, which means there are certain families or certain companies that really donate a lot of money to the institution to make sure that it is secure, it is growing. Yung iba po, ang mga fundraising nila medyo bongga. If you are familiar with the Met Gala in New York, that's actually a fundraising activity for the museum and for the exhibits, for their fashion exhibits. So may mga fundraising activities that private institutions can do to make sure that there's enough money for security, enough money to preserve the items that they have, and sometimes to have enough money to acquire items. In the case of the Philippines, marami sa mga museums po dito talaga nagsa-struggle. Kasi nga hindi naman uso dito yung mga institusyon na bibigay ng milyones sa mga museum. Uh, Marami sa kanila yung naka-attach sa company. So yung company ang nagpopondo ng all their needs. But in the case of NHCP and NM, taxpayer money yung main source of income. And then pag may nag-donate, that's well and good. And yun, parang ganun. So ang kawawa ho dito, yung mga museums na neither rich nor government. And dito po yung magandang pagplanuhan po ng Imus Historical Society, for example, na how do we make sure na sustainable? I've heard na may cafe daw po na may masarap na kape sa floor heritage center. I think that's okay. That's a good step to make sure that the museum that we're establishing.
Okay, for Sir Elmer Enriquez, we see your raise hand button, so you may now unmute.
Um, Thank you very much, Bradley. We would like to thank also Mr. Agbayani for the information which you have shared to each one of us. Ito po yung tanong ko. There's someone who would like to donate an artifact for the museum to be displayed. One thing is that of course, we have questions. Kasi po, yung kanya pong idodonate ay sculpture ng isang popular na isang pintor. Yung pintor po ay si Amorsolo. So palagay ko po di unusual po yun na supposedly isang pintor ang ginagawa niya isang trabaho ng isang sculptor. And another thing na notice ko po kasi na meron pong damage yung artifact. It's actually a bust of a woman. Hindi ko po ma-recognize kung sino po yon. Pero po, how do we go about a process na para ma-verify yung authenticity ng work, no po, without really offending the persons who's donating it? Kasi siyempre po, in the heart of the person donating, sa kanya po ay malaking bagay ito. And supposedly, it's a great honor also for the museum if indeed that is actually the work of Amorsolo. Yun lang po. Maraming salamat.
Thank you po, Sir Elmer, sa tanong niyo po. Very interesting case. Una sa lahat, hindi naman po 100% imposible na ang isang pintor ay mag-sculpt. Katulad po niya, si Guillermo Tolentino, we know na meron din siyang ginawang sketches, although he is a sculptor. Pangalawa po, dito po papasok yung isang tungkulin ng isang museum, which is researching. Marami naman pong naisulat tungkol kay Amorsolo, ano po yung style niya of painting and sculpting. Baka po kasi may iba pa ho siyang nililok na bagay na posible natin ikumpara yung style noong pong idodonate na item sa style po nung may iba pa hong sample. Marami naman din po tayong art historians who can help verify the story. And maganda din po, ang may term po dito yung provenance. Baka po kasi yung magdodonate, meron siya halimbawa na letter from Amorsolo telling the story. Tapos pwede natin ikumpara po yan sa mga other letters ni Amorsolo. Ganyan ba siya sumulat? Ganyan ba yung paraan niya ng pagsasalita? Those are the many things that we can do to make to verify the authenticity po ng gamit. I would recommend na mag-consulta po tayo sa National Museum of the Philippines. Ang dami ho nilang Amorsolo doon. So, posible na they can help check kung mukha pa talaga itong Amorsolo and kung known ba na nag-sculpt si Amorsolo. Now, darating po talaga yung panahon na may mga items po tayo na hindi 100% na alam natin yung kwento niya. Sa NACP po maraming ganyan na nandun sa bahay, so ano pong kwento nito? Tapos di namin alam kasi hindi naman nakwento sa amin kung ano ba yung kwento nito. Kaya po pwede naman ho tayo when we write the narrative, when we write the exhibition text, we can say na this is probably or this is said to be by so and so, believed to be from the time of so and so. Mayroon po yung tawag namin po dyan sa history is mga hedge words. Para hindi natin sinasabi din, no, 100% naniniwala kami dito. Pero ito yung sinabi nung nagpahiran, ganyan. So yun po, may process naman po pwede tayo sundin to verify the authenticity of the artifact. And many people, I hope and I believe, are willing to help with that. Dagdag lang po, we also have to ask ourselves din po, swak po ba yung item sa kwentong gusto nating ikwento sa museum? Kasi po kung halimbawa tungkol sa Imus yung story, how does that item fit into the narrative? Posible pwede natin sabihin na kasi ang Imus ay isang mayamang pook, kaya kaya ng mga taga roon na makatanggap ng very rare na Amorsolo sculpture. So parang ganun po yung kailangan din natin isipin kasi marami naman po willing magbigay. Yun lang po, paano natin may iwasan na maging literal na tambakan yung ating pong museo. We choose what we get and what we receive. So, yun po. Maraming salamat po sa tanong, Sir Edmer.
Maraming salamat rin po.
All right, Yufi, we have still one question here from Mr. John Paul Abellera. How do museums cope with the COVID-19 pandemic? Have they shifted to presenting their collections online?
And thank you very much for that question, Sir Abeliera. And I'm sorry if at certain points, mahina po yung boses ko. I hope people was able to hear what I was saying during that time. No? A lot of museums cope with the COVID-19 pandemic first by going online. Sabi nga po niya, that means yung mga pictures na ginagamit, for example, sa pag-document ng items, sa paggawa ng accession list, those things can help na ipinopost siya online with a story. Like, hindi naman, halimbawa, kung may lumang item, sabi natin, lumang sapatos, the way we post it, hindi basta, oh yeah, may lumang sapatos kami, bahala kayo dyan. We tell the story. Meron talagang kahit maiksi na itong sapatos na ito ay pagmamayari ni ganyan, uh, ito ay yaring ganito, nung panahong ganito, at ito ay significant dahil yan. So a lot of museums have also gaya na sinabi ni ninyo po, Mr. Abeliera, have been doing online exhibits in which mag-upload sila ng album featuring certain images or certain items within their collection. And that's the way they present their collections. No? Um, at the same time, sa mga lugar where visiting physically is allowed, syempre sumusunod tayo sa health protocols, wearing face mask, wearing face shield. In the case of NHCP museums, we have 8 out of 27 na nasa labas naman ng NCR Plus and Batangas. What they do, minimize po yung contact between the museum staff and the visitor. So, yung mga technology namin, lahat yon patay kasi hindi mo pwedeng dutututin yung touchscreen terminal, baka nandun na si COVID. We also make sure na very documented kung sino yung mga pumapasok so that pag kailangan mag-contact tracing, nagagawa siya. And we also limit the number of people entering. So they have to kailangan po nilang mag-register ahead para ma-assignan po sila ng oras. Oras lang na huli na yun sila pwedeng bumisita at parang ganun. At nalilimit din yung number of people inside para hindi magkaroon ng mass gathering sa loob ng museo. And of course, hindi rin tayo tumatanggap muna ng bata at saka above 65 para rin po sa kanilang sariling kaligtasan. So yun po, museums have been forced to go online to present their collections because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And they also were forced to cut back on bills, to cut back on expenses. And marami ang ginagawa na lamang is webinars like this one para po matiyak na may ginagawa pa rin yung museum, hindi po siya namamatay kahit may COVID. Maraming salamat muli, Sir John Paul Abelier, for the question.
All right. Dr. Arlene Saunya, you may now unmute so that you can relay the question.
Talagang maraming salamat po, Sir Yufi, kasi ang dami naming natutunan, although kailangan may part 2. Ang tanong ko lang po ay, sa pagtatayo ng aming museo, so in particular po itong project ng Imus Historical Society, meron ba po tayong mga patakaran na binibigay ng NHCP or ng NCCA para lang po ma-monitor na maayos ang takbo o pamamalakad ng aming mga proyekto? Meron ba po silang specific rules?
As far as I remember po, yung tipong rules na kapag hindi nyo po nasunod, makukulong kayo, wala pong ganon. or pag hindi nyo po nasunod, wala na kayong lisensya, magsara na yung museum. Wala pong ganon. Actually, wala pong lisensya ng museum. So anyone, literally, anyone can make a museum. It's literal. But we do encourage the museum to join yung appropriate regional association of museums. Kasi po yung guidance on how you run the museum, they can help. Nandiyan na po yung benchmarking. So, sabihin ni certain museum, oh, this is what we're doing. Baka gusto nyo gayahin, baka gusto nyo i-adapt sa inyong museum. Um, pag meron po kayong, halimbawa, suliranin and you need help, pwede po silang makatulong. So, yun po yung value ng pagsama sa mga Regional Association of Museums. On the part of NHCP, siguro ang rules lang po namin is more on how you treat the artifact and how you treat the building. Kung bagong building naman, yan, walang problema. Kung lumang bahay po yan, yan na yung mga rules na kailangan paalam sa NHCP bago i-modify, ganyan. Yung sa pagtrato po ng artifacts, again, ang dami ho kasi lumang gamit sa Pilipinas. Kaya po, ito rin po yung sad part. Kung hindi po masusumbong sa amin, hindi namin ma-actionan. So ito po yung nangyayari sa maraming lugar na, ay, binenta na si ganito, ay, giniba, ay, sinira. Kasi po, we don't have enough eyes to look at the 7,640 islands in the Philippines and check each one na okay siya. And even when we have, cases filed, depende pa ho yan kung mananalo. Alam naman ho natin yung nangyari sa Torre de Manila. So yung mga ganun po. So yun po, wala naman pong hard and fast rule. May guidelines, mayroon pong tips. And activities like this, nakakatulong po siya to develop. Kailangan po kasi yung museum itself also develops its own museum manual para po makatulong sa museum staff how to manage the collections. Pero yung, gaya po ng sabi ko, kung yung tipong bawal at hindi bawal, na tipong pag hindi mo nagawa, makukulong ka. Wala pong ganon, sadly. Eh, thank you po, ma'am. Dr. Sauya, for that question.
All right. Tita Liabres, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, thank you. I'm just curious. How would we classify like the canons which are outside of a museum? It's not being housed. The canons in Corregidor or the tunnels. So how will we classify them? They're just outside, rotting away. So are they considered also part of a museum?
If their owners want to make it part of a museum, then they can be considered part of a museum. Hindi po nag-iisa yung corregidor sa ganitong sitwasyon. For example, yung AFP Museum, sa labas po niya may mga lumang tangke, may helicopter. At nung nakakabisita po ako doon once, naranasan namin sakyan yung helicopter. So, may mga ganun naman po, mga museum sa mayroong mga outdoor installations. And then may mga paraan naman po para ma-preserve itong mga bagay na hindi maipasok indoors. Possibly pinipintahan po siya minsan or pinimake sure na yung mga kalawang tinatanggal. Yung mga ganun, may mga paraan naman po to preserve them kahit sila po ay nasa labas. May museum po kami, yung Museo Jose Rizal Dapitan. Yung museum, may building na nandun yung mga display, pero yung mga bahay, yung reconstruction ng mga bahay na tinirahan ni Rizal is also part of the museum. And pati yung mga statue sa labas, so may statue doon ni Rizal habang naglalakad, may statue ni Rizal habang kausap sa Pia Valenzuela. They are also considered part of the museum. And ang isa po naming statue doon, pati yung hayop, more or less, part ng museum. Kasi pinagbawalan kami ng DNR pumatay ng hayop po doon. So pati yung ahas, pati yung mga palaka, at saka yung mga ipis doon, hindi namin pwedeng patayin kasi yun naman yung natural history part ng museum na kailangan din po namin i-preserve. So yun po, kahit po outdoor, pwede po siya makonsidera na part ng museum if the owners want to consider it as such.
Okay. Dr. Arlene, you can unmute again. I think I see your hands is raising. If you have
Opo,
questions.
kasi gusto ko lang pong ipailam kay Sir Eufy na kaibigan po namin yung mga curator ng mga kalapit na museo dito sa Cavite. At siguro talagang very accommodating naman po sila. So I'm sure like si Miss Paulette sa Museo ng Aguinaldo, ang galing-galing nga din niya kasi napakinggan ko rin siya mag-lecture dun sa isang LHCN seminar. At marami pang mga aspeto na talagang dapat naming isipin para so kailangan lang makibanding kami doon sa mga asosasyon ng mga museo at sinasuggest niyo nga po na itong Cavite ay kasama sa Region 4. So salamat po doon sa inyong suggestion.
Salamat din po, Dr. Sauya. At ano po, magaling po talaga si Ma'am Paulette. So, kung makakatulong po talaga siya sa inyo.
Apo.
Saka,
At saka kayo, napakagaling.
thank you po.
Maraming salamat po. Talagang intindido namin yung nais nyong ipadating sa amin.
Maraming salamat po, Dr. Dr. Sauya.
All right, we have a question from the chat box from Phoebe Sevilla. Is it better or safer to donate artifacts to private museums than public museums? We hear news of items getting quote unquote lost or stolen and families donating artifacts only to see them being sold to auctions.
Yan po, malungkot po yan, although I cannot confirm or deny those information. Kaya po dito mahalaga yung pinanggit ko po kanina na deed of donation and loan agreement. Kasi itong mga pamilya na nag-donate, pag nakita nila sa certain gallery, na natin bigyan ng pangalan, yung item, they can tell the yung institution na pinag-donate nila, oh, paano napunta sa kanila yan? And once pag nakita nila, oh, may deed of donation, that's one way for them to make legal action para mabawi yung item. Hindi natin tinatago na nagkaroon ng instance before na may mga nagpipilfer na items sa mga government property. And yun po yung iniiwasan na natin ngayon, lalo na ng mga bagong generasyon ng kawani ng gobyerno. So kaya po mahalaga yung accessioning at saka po yung pagtitiyak na documented lahat ng items sa loob ng collection. Now, is it better or safer to donate artifacts to private museums than public museums? Depende po sa museum. If you donate it to a private museum that has the capacity to care for them, na may pondo po para i-secure sila, na magkaroon po sila ng tamang temperature, humidity, and conservation. Conservation po pala yung general term sa pagtitiyak na ang isang item ay safe and preserved. Conservation. Kung may pera sila at kung may capability sila, hindi po mamasamain ng NHCP na ibigay nyo po sa kanila. Hindi rin po mamasamain ng NM. Pero ang masasabi ko sa inyo, especially sa National Museum at sa NHCP, is that we're doing our part to make sure that the items donated to us are secure, preserved, and accessible. Hindi nga lang may COVID kaya hindi pa natin mapa-accessible na lahat-lahat. So yun po. Hindi po kasi yung case kasi pag private museum yan na hindi nyo po kayo 100% confident sa sustainability niya, baka sila din yung magbenta. So yun yung iniiwasan natin. So that's on a case-to-case basis. Maganda po kasi pag dinonate nyo po yan sa public museums, pwede ko kayong magsampa ng kaso sa husgado kapag nakita ninyong pinapabayaan yung item ninyo. At pwede po kayong mag-demand na bawiin niyo. Thank you po for that question, ma'am.
All right. Dr. Castañeda, you may unmute so that you can ask your question to Eufy.
Then meron pa isa sa chat. First of all, thank you very much, Mr. Agbayani. It's been very enlightening. Now, our museum is practically just very, very new, and we will be very honest. This is an endeavor that we took in which we have no idea whatsoever on how to go about it, and we're just studying matters. So to the minimum, just to start with it, how many staff do you think must be necessary? And what are those staff?
Um, yung nabanggit ko po na interior designer, architect, electrician, and carpenter, that is just for the setting up of the exhibits. Once they're done setting up the exhibit, they can go about with their own lives na. But for the day-to-day, for the permanent one, you need at least one curator and one museum guide. Ito po yung aminin ko ho, at siguro ito ay imbitasyon na rin sa mga kasama natin nandito. Sometimes yung NACP museums, dahil po sa dami niya at sa dami din po ng at sa kakauntian ng tao, minsan nangyayari isang tao, isang museum. Tapos security na lang at saka naglilinis. Pero that's not ideal. As much as possible po, we have one curator, one museum guard, at saka po uh, janitor. Just to make sure na hindi po siya mapabayaan. Now, depende din po yan kung gaano po niyo kadalas bubuksan yung museum for public visits. Kasi kung this is my, how do you call this, by schedule, baka po pwede tayo mag-cut back sa staff. And depende rin po kung malaki syempre yung lugar, kailangan po natin ng mas maraming tao na nakabantay. Pero kung maliit lang po yung lugar, mas konti po kailangan natin. So basically po, kailangan din, paulit-ulit po, paulit-ulit. Isang curator, isang museum guide, isang janitor, isang guard. Masaya na po yun. Happy na po yun. And then, ang isa pong napapansin ko na hindi uso sa Pilipinas, pero uso sa ibang bansa, is yung pagkakaroon po ng mga volunteer guides, mga docent. So sometimes what they would do, yung mga maraming free time, they would volunteer tapos ang pinaka-ganansya na lang nila is food or the fun of guiding. So that helps po yung staffing ng museum. So yun po yung minimum po na kailangan natin. Now kung talagang gipit, pwede po talagang isang tao lang. Pero yun po yung discourage natin na yung taong magbabantay sa museum ay magkikwento pa, maglilinis pa, magbabantay pa, at ngayon may COVID, siya pa yung magpapasagot ng contact tracing form at saka magpapadisinfect ng mga tao. So, kawawa naman din po yung magiging tauhan po ng museum. Kung lahat po yun, siya po yung gagawa.
Thank you.
All right. Yufi, there's a question from the chat box. Do we have a standard? Sorry. This came from Miss Reach. I am a librarian, and our institution has put up a room for donated artifacts from learners, wherein the management has tasked us, the librarians, to organize the materials. The question is, do we have a standard classification system or tool that we have to follow in order to properly organize and document the artifacts?
Ito ay amin ko sa inyo, hindi ako familiar dun sa kung meron ba yung Dewey Decimal System sa pag-accession. Pero as long as you are able to establish a system na may number po yung item, na record nyo po yung size niya, length, width, depth, or may picture po doon, nakalagay po doon kung kailan na-acquire, at ano po yung information po nung item, that would be sufficient for, especially for a library that has a lot of tasks. Kasi kayo din po may iba pa po kayong classification system for the books. So hindi naman ito full-time museum. So as long as the basics are basic information are indicated doon sa accession form, that would be okay na. You need, I can send po through the Imus Historical Society a sample of the forms that we use. Kung hingin nyo po, I can ask permission from the office to provide them for you para makatulong po sa inyo pong pag-accession ng items. Thank you po, ma'am, for that question.
All right. There's also another question here from Mr. Eric Nolasco. Is there an accreditation procedure for museum guides?
As far as I remember, yung DOT meron, Department of Tourism, meron po sila accreditation procedure. But This is more on tourism oriented. So dapat trained sila na mag-accommodate ng guests, alam nila yung mga sinasabi nila. So sila yung mga usually mga guides sa may ID. In the case of NHCP, and perhaps Brian can help me with this, no, sa NM, wala akong maalala na binibigyan sila ng lisensya or ng accreditation to be guides. And I think that's something that we need to look into rin. Baka makatulong if they are given accreditation. But as far as I know, DOT has one for private sector. Um, for the public sector naman, ang nagva-vouch na sa pagiging maayos nila na museum guides ay yung government agencies kung saan sila naka-detail. But it also helps kung may accreditation tayo from DOT. Thank you po, Sir Velasco, for that question.
All right, any last questions from our audience?
May tanong po si Ma'am.
May tanong po, ayun,
Yeah.
yes,
Cataloging.
cataloging. So, all right.
Hi,
Sir,
Elmer.
Sir Elmer Enriquez, yes po, please unmute so that you can ask you the question.
Okay. Maraming salamat, Bradley. Meron po akong isang katanungan. I'm not sure if this has been discussed already a while ago or if this could be a previous question. Ang question ko po ay meron po bang restriction kung ano yung mga pwedeng i-display sa isang museum? Halimbawa po, katulad kanina kasi narinig ko kasi yung question ni Tita about yung mga kanyon daw doon sa corridor, gano'n. What if we are displaying, let's say, weapons, old guns or mga bolos inside the museum? Are there special permits which we have to get if we are displaying such items inside the museum? Yan lang po. Salamat po.
Thank you po for that question, Sir Elmer. This is really important. Insider info, based on experience ko po sa NHCP, hindi na po namin kinailangan mag-secure ng permit from PNP or from the Bureau of Fire Protection pag nagdi-display po kami ng polo or ng weapons. But we make our due diligence to make sure na yung items ay talagang wala ng bala, wala ng pulbura, hindi na matalas, or kung matalas man yung bolo, we display it in such a way na hindi po siya mahahawakan ng visitor. So yun po, hindi naman po kami nire-require ng PNP at saka ng Bureau of Fire Protection na humingi ng special permit pag mag-display nito mga bagay nito. But of course, even if we're not required, we also make our due diligence na make sure na okay po sila. However, pag may doubts po kayo, talagang patingin nyo na po sa PNP at sa BFP kasi baka naman masyado ho tayong confidence sa ating sariling kakayahan, yung mga pillbox at saka mga, mga mina nung panahon ng World War II, din-display natin. Tapos hindi pa natin ho pinatingin sa conservator kung okay ba siya o hindi. Mahirap po yon. So, it doesn't hurt. Hindi po kami inobliga. It doesn't hurt to consult experts in the PNP and BFP before displaying these items. Yun lang po. Konting chika lang. Kung bomba po yan, kasi literal na bomba, kasi may mga nahuhukay pa hong bomba ngayon, mas malaki po ang chance na i-detonate na lang po siya ng Bureau of Fire Protection kaysa ibalik sa inyo na wala ng lamang pulbura. So yan, yung mga granada, pillbox, bomba, mga mortar shell, mas likely na i-detonate na lang siya for the safety of everyone kaysa payagan kayo i-display siya. Thank you po, Sir Edward, for that question.
Okay, I believe that we have reached now the latter part of the program. May we go on the certificate of participation, award for Mr. Eufemio Agbayani for his seminar talk on museum management. May I call on Mr. Elmer Enriquez, the Vice President of the Imus Historical Society, to give this virtually since we cannot do this in person.
Okay, may I please read on this certification? Imus Historical Society, General Castañeda Street, Poblacion 1B, City of Imus, Cavite. This certificate of appreciation is given to Eufemio O. Agbayani III for sharing his valuable knowledge as the resource speaker for the seminar on museum management organized by the Imus Historical Society, given this 17th day of April at the city of Imus. Signed, Roberto R. Castañeda, PhD, Chairperson, and Jose Elmer B. Francisco, President.
All right. Certificate of participation will be given to the registered participants for tonight. We will be sending you the link for you to accomplish the evaluation form. You will receive an e-certificate. And for some closing remarks, I would like to call on again Mr. Elmer Enriquez for some few words.
Thank you very much again, Bradley, and to all of those who made this webinar possible tonight. Sa pangalan po ng aming Pangulo sa Imus Historical Society na si Ginoong Jose Elmer Francisco, kami po ay lubos nagpapasalamat sa mga lahat ng sumama sa isang seminar na ito. Kayo man po ay kabahagi ng Imus Historical Society o yung mga taong may mga interest po sa ganitong mga bagay tungkol sa history ng ating bansa. Gusto ko lang pong ulitin ang sinabi ng chairperson ng Imus Historical Society, maging sino po man sa inyo na may interest o may kagustuhan na maging bahagi ng Imus Historical Society, kayo po ay aming malugod na tinatanggap. Isa lang pong letter of intent, hindi lang po malugod namin tinatanggap, kundi kasama po rin dito ay ang aming sariling pangangailangan para magkaroon ng isang matagumpay na pagbubukas ng isang museo. Sa huling pananalita, kami po ay nagpapasalamat po muli ng may buong puso sa ibinigay na panahon at oras ni Ginoong Eufemio Agbayani III. Marami po kaming bagay na hindi nalalaman noong araw na nalinawan ngayon. Sana po ay hindi kayo magsawa sa panahon na maaring ibigay para po sa amin upang lalo po naming mapalaganap, hindi lang po sa aming bayan, kundi ma-share po namin ang kaalaman na to pati sa mga ibang bayan ng Cavite kung paano po magkaroon ng isang matagumpay na pagbubukas at pagkakaroon ng isang museo. Maraming salamat po, Ginoong Agbayani.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Enriquez. This wraps up our seminar event. Before you leave, once again, we kindly advise everyone to accomplish the survey form for this event, and the link is provided in the chat box. Your feedback is important to us. Once again, thank you and good night, everyone from the Imus Historical Society. See you on our next webinar series.